The humid Louisiana air clung to Ilara's skin the moment she stepped from the taxi, thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and distant rain. It was a living breath, this air, heavy with the weight of centuries and stories yet untold. She had come to New Orleans not as a tourist seeking revelry, but as a folklorist chasing whispers, a researcher drawn to the spectral heartbeat of the Deep South. Her destination was a guest house on the edge of the French Quarter, a building whose wrought iron balconies curled like ancient sleeping serpents and whose pale yellow facade was softened by a patina of time and moisture. The innkeeper, a man with eyes the color of old whiskey and a voice that seemed to rumble up from the earth itself, greeted her at the heavy oak door. His name was Thibodeau, and he moved with the slow, deliberate grace of someone intimately acquainted with history. He showed her to her room on the second floor, a space dominated by a four-poster bed and a large window that overlooked a tangled, shadowed courtyard. As he placed her suitcase by the armoire, his gaze lingered on her, not with suspicion, but with a peculiar, knowing sadness. Ilara felt it then. The first true pull of the place. It was not a sound or a sight, but a sensation, a deep, resonant hum in the very marrow of her bones, a feeling of immediate and eerie connection. The floorboards seemed to sigh under her weight, and the faded floral wallpaper whispered of countless other occupants who had slept, dreamed, and perhaps never truly left. Later, over a cup of strong, dark chicory coffee in the parlor, Thibodeau spoke. His words were measured, low, as if he were afraid of being overheard by the portraits of severe-looking ancestors lining the walls. He spoke of the city's soul, a tapestry woven with threads of joy and profound sorrow. He told her of the legends that were not mere stories to the locals, but chapters of a shared living history. He mentioned the restless dead who walked the cobblestones, the things that watched from the murky waters of the bayou, and the old magic that still simmered just beneath the surface of everyday life. He warned her gently that some truths once sought could not be unseen. Some doors once opened could not be closed. Ilara listened, her researcher's mind cataloging every detail. But her soul felt a chill that had nothing to do with the slowly turning ceiling fan. She had arrived seeking academic curiosity, but the city and this old house within it offered something else entirely, an invitation or perhaps a challenge, written in the language of ghosts and forgotten sorrows. That night, as she lay in the antique bed, the whispers of the innkeeper's stories seemed to weave themselves into the rustle of the oak leaves outside her window, a haunting lullaby for a world that thrived just beyond the veil. Number 1. The Lougarou Mansion. The morning sun did little to warm the chill that had settled in Ilara's bones overnight. After a breakfast of beignets dusted with powdered sugar that tasted like sweetened ghosts, she set out for Royal Street, her notebook tucked under her arm and a sense of grim purpose in her step. The address was infamous, a name spoken in hushed, reverent horror by historians and thrill-seekers alike, the Lougarou Mansion. Even before she turned the corner, the air grew heavier, the cheerful sounds of the French Quarter fading into a muffled silence, as if the very street was holding its breath. There it stood, a grand, columned monument to antebellum elegance, its white paint gleaming almost too brightly under the sun, a stark and beautiful lie. The sheer scale of it was imposing, its balconies iron-laced and ornate, yet Ilara felt no admiration, only a deep instinctual recoil. This was a place of profound suffering, a beautiful shell housing a rotten core. The opulence felt like a slap in the face to the memory of what had occurred within. She joined a small tour group gathered at the wrought iron gate, their guide a woman with a somber expression and eyes that had seen too many tourists come and go, their curiosity often morphing into pale-faced dread. As the guide began to speak, her voice was low and steady, recounting the history of Madame Delphine Lalaurie, a socialite celebrated for her lavish parties in these very rooms. The narrative then turned, as it always must, to the horrific discovery in 1834 A fire had broken out, and rescuers, forcing their way into the locked attic, had found not stored finery but a secret chamber of horrors, enslaved individuals, tortured and mutilated, chained to walls and operating tables. The guide described the medical experiments, the brutal implements, the sheer calculated cruelty that had transpired behind this elegant facade. As the words washed over her, Alara's skin prickled. A sudden intense cold spot enveloped her, a pocket of winter air in the humid New Orleans morning. She shivered violently, rubbing her arms, but the tourists nearby seemed unaffected, fanning themselves in the heat. Then, faint but unmistakable, a sound threaded through the guide's monologue, a high, thin scream, choked and desperate, that seemed to emanate not from the street, but from the very bricks of the mansion itself. It was gone as quickly as it came, leaving behind a ringing silence that was somehow louder. Alara's gaze was drawn upward to a second-floor window, its curtains drawn. A profound sense of being watched washed over her, a malevolent pressure that fixed itself between her shoulder blades. It was not a casual observation, but a focused, hungry attention. The beautiful house seemed to lean over her, its windows like dead, watching eyes. The history was no longer a story in a book. It was a living, breathing presence, and it had taken note of the new listener on its doorstep. She took an involuntary step back, the urge to flee a primal drumbeat in her blood, yet her feet remained rooted, held by a macabre fascination and the dawning realization that her research had just become terrifyingly personal. Driven by a morbid compulsion that overrode her fear, Alara lingered after the tour group dispersed, her eyes scanning the periphery of the property as if the very ground might yield its secrets. Near the side gate, partially obscured by overgrown Confederate jasmine, a rusted metal box lay half buried in the damp earth. Her fingers, trembling slightly, pried it open to reveal a cache of papers, brittle, water-stained, but miraculously preserved. They were not official records, but scrawled accounts, desperate testimonies from a handful of souls who had escaped the attic's horrors before the fire. The handwriting was frantic, the ink faded to a ghostly brown, detailing not only the physical tortures inflicted by Madame Lalaurie, but also the whispered rumors of her dabbling in dark arts to extend her own life and maintain her control. One page, written in a different, more measured hand, described how a voodooine, Mambo Celeste, had been secretly summoned by neighbors disturbed by the unnatural sounds and smells emanating from the property. Under cover of night, she had placed protections around the mansion's foundation, bundles of herbs, bones, and small mirrors wrapped in black cloth, not to cleanse the house, for its evil was too deeply rooted, but to bind the malevolence within its walls and prevent the tormented spirits from being drawn out to haunt the innocent. The protections were a containment field, a spiritual quarantine on a place too corrupted to ever be healed. As Alara absorbed this grim history, the air in the shaded alleyway grew thick and still. The cheerful noise from Royal Street seemed to warp and stretch, becoming a distant, muffled hum. The pages in her hand felt suddenly ice-cold. A deep shadow began to coalesce in the corner of the garden, detaching itself from the others. It was not the absence of light, but a substance of its own, a shifting humanoid form of absolute blackness that seemed to drink the light from the air around it. It had no discernible features, yet she felt its gaze, a piercing cold that reached into her soul. It was the watchful presence she had felt from the window, given form and terrible intention. A wave of pure, undiluted terror seized her. This was not a residual echo or a cold spot. This was an intelligence, a sentient malice that knew she had uncovered its secrets. The shadow figure began to glide toward her, silent and inexorable, its movement causing the vibrant green leaves of the jasmine to wilt and blacken where it passed. The urge to flee became a biological imperative, overriding all thought. She dropped the papers, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She turned and ran, not looking back, her breath catching in ragged sobs. The beautiful, hateful mansion seemed to loom over her, its windows now like gaping mouths, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her blood that the thing of shadow was following, its silent pursuit more terrifying than any sound. She did not stop running until she was back amidst the crowds and the sunlight of the French Quarter, but the feeling of that cold, intelligent gaze lingered on her skin, a brand of terror she knew she would carry forever. Number 2. Rougarou in the Bayou. The lingering dread of the Lalaurie mansion clung to Alara like a second skin, a chill that the New Orleans sun could not dispel. Seeking a different kind of haunting, one born of wilderness and whispered superstition rather than urban atrocity, she pointed her rental car west toward the sprawling, moss-draped swamplands outside Lafayette. The city's gaslit elegance gave way to flat, watery expanses where the sky met the earth in a seamless, green-tinged horizon. The air grew thicker here, saturated with the rich, decaying perfume of cypress knees, stagnant water, and blooming water hyacinth. It was a world both beautiful and deeply primeval. Her destination was a cluster of weathered homes on stilts at the edge of the Atchafalaya Basin, where the oldest members of the Cajun community held court on sagging porches. She found them, men and women with faces carved by time and the harsh sun, their eyes holding the deep, still knowledge of the bayou. They spoke in the soft, melodic cadence of Cajun French, their words often trailing off into thoughtful silence. When she mentioned the Rougarou, a palpable stillness fell over the group. It was not a legend to them. It was a warning passed down through generations, a story used to keep children from wandering into the treacherous swamps at night. One elder, a man named Claude, with hands gnarled like cypress roots, described it not as a mere werewolf, but as a cursed soul, a shapeshifter doomed to hunt the wetlands for 101 days. He spoke of a terrible howl that was neither dog nor wolf, but something infinitely older and more sorrowful, a sound that could freeze the blood in a man's veins. Another woman, her voice a dry rustle, told of finding enormous, distorted tracks in the mud after such a cry had echoed through the night, prints that were almost human, but twisted with claws that dug deep into the earth. They were stories of a boundary between man and beast being violently erased, a punishment for breaking sacred taboos. Alara transcribed their words, her own skin prickling at the raw, fearful conviction in their voices. As dusk bled into a deep velvet night, she retreated to a small, isolated cabin she had rented on the water's edge. The sounds of the swamp amplified in the darkness, the chorus of frogs, the splash of a gator sliding into the water, the incessant drone of insects. She sat on the rickety porch, trying to process the elder's tales, the notebook heavy in her lap. It was then that the other sounds ceased, as if a switch had been thrown. Into that sudden, profound silence came a sound that made her blood turn to ice. It was a howl, long and drawn out, rising from the depths of the cypress grove across the black water. It was exactly as Claude had described, a sound of immense agony and predatory intent, utterly unnatural. Her breath caught in her throat. A primal fear, older than reason, locked her in place. The howl did not come again, but the normal night sounds did not return. The swamp held its breath. Compelled by a terror she could not name, she grabbed her flashlight and stepped off the porch, its beam a shaky sword cutting through the oppressive dark. She swept the light along the muddy bank where the water met her small plot of land. And there they were, fresh, deep impressions in the soft earth, already slowly filling with seepage. They were massive, the size of a large man's hand, but elongated, with 4 distinct toe pads and deep gouges at the front where claws had sunk into the mud. They led from the water's edge to within 10 feet of her cabin steps, where they turned and disappeared back into the impenetrable darkness of the swamp. She stood frozen, the beam of her light trembling on those monstrous tracks, a stark physical testament to the stories that were no longer just stories. The Rougarou had come calling. Number 3. The Crying Woman of Bayou Teche. The monstrous tracks outside her cabin were a line she could not cross, a tangible proof that the legends of the bayou were not merely tales told to frighten children. With the Rougarou's visitation burning in her memory, Alara knew she could not stay. She packed her things hastily as the first gray light of dawn filtered through the Spanish moss, the swamp slowly returning to its daytime chorus, as if the horrors of the night had never been. Yet the deep, clawed impressions in the mud remained, a silent, chilling farewell. She drove further into Acadiana, following the lazy, meandering curve of Bayou Teche. The water here was dark as strong tea, reflecting the overhanging oaks and the occasional weathered fishing shack. The atmosphere was different from the vast wilderness of the Atchafalaya. It felt more intimate, more sorrowful. In the small town of Breaux Bridge, she found a diner where the coffee was strong and the patrons were willing to talk, their faces softening with a shared grief when she asked not of monsters, but of lost souls. They spoke of her, the femme qui pleure, the crying woman. Her story was a familiar ache in the community, a tragedy so profound it had tattooed itself onto the very air above the bayou. Generations ago, a young Acadian mother had been traveling by pirogue with her 2 small children during a sudden violent squall. The boat had capsized in the churning, rain-lashed waters. She had fought the current but could save neither her son nor her daughter, watching in helpless agony as the dark water swallowed them whole. Her own body was found days later, but her spirit, they said, never moved on. It was said she refused to believe they were gone, condemned to wander the banks for eternity, weeping and calling their names into the silent night, searching for the children the bayou would never give back. The raw pain in the telling was palpable. This was not a story of malevolence, but of boundless, unending grief. That afternoon, driven by a solemn respect for the legend, Alara found a semi-cleared spot on the bank of the Teche, far from any roads or homes. She set up a simple camp as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of violet and burnt orange. The air was still, the only sounds the gentle lap of water against the cypress knees and the distant call of a heron. As full darkness fell, the bayou became a world of silhouettes and whispers. She sat wrapped in a blanket, a single lantern casting a small pool of light, her recorder on and her notebook open. Though she wrote nothing, she simply waited, listening to the heavy, breathing silence. Then, as the old clock tower in a distant town chimed 12, the night changed. The insects fell silent. The water stilled. A coldness seeped from the bayou, a damp chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. And then it came, a sound so clear, so heart-wrenchingly human, that it stole the air from her lungs. It was the sound of a woman sobbing, a raw, gut-wrenching expression of loss that carried perfectly across the black water. It was not loud, but it was impossibly distinct, each choked breath and mournful wail a testament to a pain that had transcended death itself. The sound seemed to originate from a dense patch of shadows on the far bank, a place where the moonlight did not reach. Alara sat frozen, not in fear, but in a profound and aching empathy. She was not being watched or hunted. She was being allowed to witness. The sorrowful weeping continued for what felt like an eternity, a private eternal vigil for 2 lost children, a sound that would forever be woven into the fabric of the bayou night. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and far more haunting than before. Number 4. The Voodoo Queen's Curse. The lingering echo of the weeping woman's sorrow seemed to follow Alara all the way back to New Orleans, a haunting melody underscoring her journey. The city welcomed her back, not with its usual festive clamor, but with a watchful, knowing silence. Her research now carried a new weight, a tangible connection to the grief and terror that stained the land. It was no longer academic, it was a conversation with the dead, and there was no figure in Louisiana's spectral history more powerful, more complex, or more revered than the Voodoo Queen herself, Marie Laveau. Alara's days were spent in dusty archives and historical societies, piecing together the life of the legendary priestess. She read of a woman of immense power and compassion, a hairdresser to the wealthy Creole women who was also the spiritual leader of the enslaved and the oppressed. Marie Laveau was a paradox, a devout Catholic who presided over vibrant voodoo ceremonies in Congo Square, a woman who could allegedly curse a plantation owner into ruin or heal a sick child with equal ease. Her legacy was a tapestry woven with threads of faith, magic, justice, and fear. Alara learned of the 3 X's marked on her tomb, a tradition born of the belief that drawing them and making a wish could summon her aid or her wrath. The culmination of her research led her to St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, as the afternoon sun began to cast long, distorted shadows through the above-ground tombs. The air within the necropolis was still and chalky, thick with the dust of centuries and the press of countless souls. The tombs stood shoulder to shoulder like a silent marble city, their inscriptions weathered by time and salt air. Finding Marie Laveau's final resting place was not difficult. It was the one adorned with a collection of small offerings, colorful beads, half-burned candles, coins, and bundles of dried herbs. The tomb itself was covered in a chaotic mosaic of chalky X's, layered one upon the other by countless hopeful and desperate hands. As Alara stood before it, a profound sense of reverence and unease settled over her. The energy here was different from the malevolence of the Lougarou mansion or the sorrow of the bayou. It was potent, ancient, and fiercely intelligent. She was so absorbed in studying the cryptic markings that she didn't notice the approach of another figure until a shadow fell across the tomb. The woman was tall and statuesque, her age impossible to determine. Her dark skin was smooth, but her eyes held the deep, still knowledge of countless generations. She was dressed simply, but around her neck hung an assortment of beads and a small, worn leather pouch. She moved with a silent, deliberate grace that seemed to part the heavy air around her. She did not greet Alara, but instead looked directly at the tomb, her expression unreadable. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was low and melodic, yet it carried an undeniable weight of authority. She explained that she was a practitioner, a keeper of the old ways. She spoke of Marie not as a historical figure, but as a living force, a Loa who still walked between the worlds, her power undiminished by death. Then her gaze shifted to Alara, and her eyes seemed to see straight through to the lingering chill of the Lalaurie shadow and the echo of the Rougarou's howl. Her tone grew grave. She warned Alara that the path she was walking was paved with more than curiosity. Seeking truths, especially those guarded by the spirits, was like lighting a beacon in the world of the unseen. It did not just illuminate the past, it attracted attention. Restless spirits, drawn to the light of a seeking heart, could become attached, their unfinished business becoming her own. Some truths were meant to sleep, she said, and waking them came with a price. The tomb before them seemed to pulse with a silent agreement, and Alara felt the warning sink into her bones, a cold seed of dread taking root. She wasn't just studying legends anymore. She was being drawn into their very current. That night, the warning from the cemetery practitioner coiled through Alara's mind like smoke, tainting her dreams with vivid, terrifying clarity. She fell into a sleep that was not rest, but a descent. Her consciousness was pulled into a whirl of sound and sensation, the feverish beat of drums that seemed to echo from the very earth, the thick, sweet scent of rum and crushed herbs, the press of bodies moving in a rhythm older than the city itself. She was standing at the edge of a clearing, hidden deep within a cypress grove, watching a ceremony unfold under a sliver of moon. A woman who could only be Marie Laveau stood at the center, her figure radiating an aura of immense power. Her head was wrapped in a bright tignon, her eyes reflecting the flames of a large bonfire. Around her, participants moved in a trance-like state, their chants a mixture of French, Creole, and languages Alara did not recognize. They were calling to the Loa. The spirits in the air crackled with the raw energy of their invocations. The ground itself seemed to tremble in response. Alara saw offerings being made, a black chicken, its lifeblood spilled into the earth, baskets of fruit, and brightly colored flags. This was not the caricature of dark magic from storybooks. It was a profound, potent communion with forces that defied simple definition, a practice born of survival, faith, and immense power. But the dream shifted, turning darker. The celebratory chants morphed into low, guttural incantations. The faces around the fire contorted not with ecstasy, but with fury and a desire for retribution. She saw Marie Laveau's hands raised not in blessing, but in judgment, her voice weaving a complex pattern of words that felt like a physical weight descending upon an unseen enemy. This was a curse, a binding of terrible intent, and Alara was trapped at its epicenter, forced to witness the terrifying potency of a wrath summoned to right a profound wrong. She tried to wake, to pull herself from the vision, but the dream held her fast, the drums pounding in time with her frantic heart. She awoke with a strangled gasp, drenched in a cold sweat, the phantom scent of smoke and ozone clinging to her nostrils. The room was pitch black, the old guest house silent around her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, the visceral terror of the dream still coursing through her veins. She fumbled for the switch on the bedside lamp, her fingers trembling. The sudden yellow light was a relief, pushing back the oppressive memory of the dream. As her eyes adjusted, her gaze fell to the floorboards beside her bed. Her breath caught in her throat. The fine layer of dust that perpetually settled in the old room had been disturbed, not by random footprints or the scatter of her own things, but by deliberate, intricate design. Drawn into the dust were a series of cryptic symbols, a cross within a circle, a zigzagging line that resembled a serpent, a pattern of interlocking loops. They were precise, intentional, and they had not been there when she went to sleep. They glowed faintly in the lamplight, a silent, unnerving message left mere inches from where she had been lost in her nightmares of voodoo rites and ancient curses. She stared at the symbols, the practitioner's warning echoing in her mind. It attracts attention. This was no random occurrence, no trick of the light. Something had been in her room while she slept, drawn by her research, her presence at the tomb, her seeking heart. It had watched her dream, and it had left its mark. The line between observer and participant had not just been blurred, it had been utterly erased. She was no longer simply recording the legends of Louisiana. She had become a character within them. Number 5. The ghostly crew of the SS Mary. The cryptic symbols etched in the dust by her bedside felt less like a message and more like a brand, a silent acknowledgement that her journey into the heart of Louisiana's haunted legacy had irrevocably crossed a threshold. Needing space from the claustrophobic, watchful streets of New Orleans, Alara turned her gaze south toward the vast, moody expanse of the Gulf Coast. Here, the legends were not rooted in soil or stone, but in water and memory, carried on salt-laden winds and the mournful cries of gulls. Her destination was a string of weathered fishing villages clinging to the marshy shoreline, where the story of the SS Mary was not a tale from a book, but a harbinger whispered with superstitious dread. The SS Mary, she learned from yellowed newspaper clippings in a maritime museum, was a coastal freighter that had vanished without a trace during a sudden violent squall in the autumn of 1928. No wreckage was ever found, no bodies recovered. It was as if the ship and its crew of 23 men had been plucked from the face of the earth. But soon after the sightings began, fishermen returning from their pre-dawn runs would speak in hushed tones in the local diners of seeing a ship materialize from a bank of impossibly thick, cold fog that appeared from nowhere. It was always the same vessel, a ghostly, spectral outline of a steamship, its running lights glowing with a faint, sickly green luminescence. It was seen sailing against the wind, its decks eerily empty, a phantom on a voyage to nowhere. Most chilling of all was its reputation as a stormbringer, a spectral herald of impending doom. Its appearance on the horizon was said to precede the most violent and unpredictable Gulf storms by mere hours. Alara found the men who had seen it not in museums, but on the docks, mending nets with gnarled fingers or gutting the day's catch, their faces leathered by sun and sea spray. They were a taciturn bunch, not given to fantasy, which made their accounts all the more compelling. One man, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if still searching for it, described a night when the sea was calm and the sky clear. A wall of freezing fog had rolled in with unnatural speed, swallowing his small boat whole. Within that silent, blinding whiteness, the massive, silent shape of the SS Mary had glided past so close he could have tossed a stone onto its deck. He saw no crew, heard no engine, only the ghostly creak of its timbers and the chill that had seeped into his very soul. He'd been found hours later, adrift and disoriented, his radio dead, his compass spinning wildly. Another, younger but with the same haunted look in his eyes, recounted being caught in a sudden squall he swore the Mary had summoned. Through the sheeting rain and howling wind, he'd seen the phantom ship riding the towering waves with an unnatural stability, a silent, mocking spectator to his struggle for survival. These were not stories told for effect. They were confessions, relived traumas shared in low, serious voices over cups of bitter coffee. They spoke of the ship not with curiosity, but with a deep-seated fear, a respect for a mystery that the sea refused to surrender. Standing on the end of a splintered wooden pier at dusk, Alara looked out at the calm, darkening waters of the Gulf. The air was still, the only sound the gentle lap of waves against the pilings. She tried to imagine the sudden wall of fog, the silent, massive shape emerging from the void. The stories of the fishermen had painted a picture so vivid it felt imprinted on the very air. She understood now that some hauntings were not confined to a single location. They were migratory, timeless, riding the currents of weather and memory. The SS Mary and its ghostly crew were forever trapped in their final moment, a perpetual replay of their last voyage, a warning from the deep that some mysteries are best left unsolved, and some ships are meant to sail forever, never reaching port. Number 6. The Melonheads of Honey Island. The Gulf's salt-tinged air was still clinging to her clothes as Alara drove east, leaving the phantom ship and its ghostly crew to their endless patrol. Her next destination felt like a descent into a different kind of primordial darkness, the Honey Island Swamp, a vast, roadless wilderness where the water was the color of strong tea, and the cypress trees stood like skeletal sentinels draped in veils of gray moss. The legends here were not of aristocratic cruelty or oceanic tragedy, but of something far more feral and unsettling. She had come to hear the whispers of the Melonheads. Her guide was a man named Bo, who met her at a rickety dock deep in the Tangipahoa Parish. He was a swamp rat through and through, with a wiry frame, eyes that missed nothing, and a quiet, cautious demeanor that spoke of a deep respect for the untamed world he navigated. His flat-bottomed pirogue was his office, and as he pulled them away from the dock and into the silent, green-hued waterways, the civilized world fell away with startling speed. The air grew thick and heavy, humming with the drone of insects and the occasional splash of something unseen sliding beneath the tea-dark water. The canopy closed overhead, filtering the sunlight into a dim emerald gloom. Bo spoke sparingly at first, pointing out a nesting eagle, a sunning alligator, the tracks of a bobcat in the mud. But when Alara cautiously broached the subject of the local legends, his posture stiffened. His voice, when he finally answered, was low, as if the trees themselves might be listening. He spoke of the Melonheads not as myth, but as a dark chapter in the swamp's history. The story went that decades ago, a remote asylum for the criminally insane had stood deep in these trackless wetlands, a place forgotten by the state and by God. A fire had consumed it, but instead of perishing, the most violent and deformed inmates had escaped into the swamp, surviving through inbreeding and sheer savagery. They were said to be small, stunted creatures with oversized, hairless heads, the Melonheads of the tales, and a taste for raw meat. Their eyes were wide and unblinking, their fingers ending in ragged nails. They lived in the most impenetrable parts of the swamp, emerging only to steal livestock or worse, to prey on anyone foolish enough to wander into their territory after dark. Bo's stories were punctuated by long, thoughtful silences, his gaze constantly scanning the dense wall of vegetation on either side of the narrow channel. He told of hunters who had vanished, of campsites found torn apart, of strange, high-pitched chattering heard in the dead of night. His conviction was absolute and deeply unnerving. They had pulled deep into a particularly silent stretch of water, where the cypress knees rose from the water like grasping hands, when the first sound echoed from the dense foliage to their left. It was not an animal sound, not the grunt of a gator or the cry of a bird. It was a wet, guttural clicking like stones being knocked together deep in a throat. It was followed by a rustle in the undergrowth that was too deliberate, too heavy for a raccoon or deer. They froze, his pole going still in the water. His face, usually an impassive mask, was etched with a sudden stark fear. His eyes locked with Alara's, and in that shared glance all his stories became terrifyingly real. Without a word he reversed his motion, poling the pirogue backward with a frantic, silent urgency. The clicking sound came again, closer this time, and was joined by another from the opposite bank. Something was moving through the palmetto thickets, keeping pace with them. They reached a slightly wider channel, and Bo didn't hesitate. He pointed a trembling finger toward a distant, barely visible marker post indicating the way back to the dock. His voice was a strained whisper. "Go. Now. Don't stop. Don't look back." And with that he turned the pirogue and poled away with a speed that churned the dark water, disappearing around a bend without a backward glance, abandoning her to the deepening silence and the things making noises in the dense, watching foliage. Alara was alone, the only sounds now the frantic beating of her own heart and the unsettling rhythmic clicking echoing from the shadows on both sides of the water. Number 7. The Curse of Jean Lafitte. The memory of the clicking sounds in the Honey Island swamp was a fresh scar on Alara's mind, a reminder that some legends were not merely echoes of the past, but living, breathing dangers. She sought a different kind of mystery now, one rooted not in feral horror, but in human greed and the promise of glittering reward. She drove south of New Orleans, toward the labyrinthine waterways and marshy islands of Barataria Bay, where the ghost of the pirate Jean Lafitte still seemed to walk the shifting sands. This was his kingdom once, a haven for privateers and smugglers, and the stories of his buried treasure were as plentiful as the seashells on the shore. The small, sun-bleached town of Jean Lafitte was a place where the past felt immediate. The air smelled of salt, mud, and diesel fuel from the fishing boats that crowded the marina. In the local library, a single-room building that also served as a historical society, Alara found her first clues. The librarian, a woman with the patient eyes of someone accustomed to treasure hunters, provided her with a brittle scrapbook filled with yellowed newspaper clippings and photocopied journal entries. They were not tales of success, but a catalog of failure and despair. She read about a Depression-era farmer who, convinced he had deciphered Lafitte's code, dug up his entire field until he was bankrupt and broken, finding only arrowheads and rot. There was the account of a wealthy oilman from Texas in the 1950s who brought in heavy machinery to dredge a section of marsh, only to have his equipment sink inexplicably into the mire and a crew member vanish without a trace. The most chilling entries were the personal journals of a historian from the 1970s, his handwriting growing progressively more erratic over the months. His final entry, scrawled in a frantic, almost illegible hand, spoke of lights moving under the water, of whispers in the fog that promised gold but demanded sanity as the price. He was found weeks later, wandering half-naked and babbling in a cane field, his mind utterly shattered, clutching a single, water-worn piece of 8. At a weathered bar overlooking the bayou, Alara found more living testaments to the curse. The old-timers nursing bottles of Abita amber had seen them all come and go. The hopefuls with their metal detectors and laminated maps, their eyes alight with dreams of easy fortune, they spoke of these seekers with a mixture of pity and grim resignation. They'd watch them head out into the marshes with confident smiles, and they'd watch them return days or weeks later, hollow-eyed, their equipment lost, their spirits broken. Some never returned at all, their boats found adrift and empty, claimed by the treacherous waters or something else entirely. The stories all shared a common thread. The treasure was not merely hidden, it was protected. It wasn't booby traps or quicksand that doomed the seekers, but a subtler, more insidious force. They spoke of a creeping paranoia that would settle over hunting partners, turning them against each other with violent suspicion. They described unnatural fogs that would roll in to disorient even the most experienced guides, and strange malfunctions of compasses and electronics. Most of all, they spoke of the madness, a slow unraveling of the mind fed by the swamp's oppressive silence, and the tantalizing, ever-elusive nature of the prize. Jean Lafitte's curse, it seemed, was not one of instant death, but of slow psychological erosion, a spectral guardian that valued sanity over life itself. Alara closed her notebook, the weight of these failed quests settling over her. She had come seeking a pirate's legend, but she had found a graveyard of ambitions and a warning written in the ruined lives of those who had dared to dig too deep. The warnings of madness and ruin should have been enough. The librarian's scrapbook of broken men and the old-timer's grim nods should have anchored her to reason. But the lure was not merely academic anymore. It was a siren call, a compulsion that had taken root deep in her psyche, fed by every ghost and legend she had encountered. It felt like the next logical, inevitable step in her descent. The very next morning, while sorting through a box of donated books in the library's back room, her fingers brushed against a seam in the cardboard that felt different. Peeling it back, she found a single sheet of parchment, brittle and foxed with age, hidden within the wall of the box itself. It was a map. It was crudely drawn. The ink faded to a spectral brown, depicting a twisting waterway through the marsh that ended at a grove of cypress trees, marked with a skull and crossbones that was less a threat and more a desperate final warning. Landmarks were denoted by symbols she half recognized from her research into Lafitte's era: a crescent moon, a dagger, a single star. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, excited rhythm. This was it. This was the sign she had been waiting for, the thread that would lead her to the heart of the mystery. She spent the day in a feverish haze, acquiring a small, flat-bottomed John boat and a sputtering outboard motor from a dubious-looking man at a dilapidated marina. She told no one of her plans. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of fire and blood, she pointed the boat into the labyrinthine channels of Barataria. The water was a glassy black mirror, perfectly reflecting the gnarled, moss-draped cypress trees that rose from it like the ruins of a sunken cathedral. The only sounds were the putter of her motor and the chorus of awakening frogs. She navigated by the map, her eyes darting from the parchment to the narrowing waterways, each turn feeling both terrifyingly wrong and impossibly right. The light was failing fast, the world reducing to shades of gray and deep blue when she found it, the grove of cypress trees, their massive twisted forms exactly as depicted on the map. A profound silence fell, the frogs and insects ceasing their songs all at once, and then she saw it, rolling in from the gulf with an unnatural silent speed, a wall of fog, thick and white as milk. It swallowed the world whole in moments, erasing the trees, the water, the sky. In an instant, she was adrift in a blinding, soundless void. The temperature plummeted, a cold that seeped through her clothes and into her bones. Her compass spun in wild, useless circles. The map in her hand was suddenly meaningless. Its landmarks vanished. She was utterly, completely disoriented, a single heartbeat in a vast, hungry whiteness. The curse of Jean Lafitte had found her, and it had begun not with whispers or madness, but with a silent, smothering isolation that felt like a tomb closing around her. Number 8. The Phantom Hitchhiker of Highway 90. The disorienting fog of Barataria had lifted as suddenly as it had descended, leaving Alara shivering and adrift in the star-pricked darkness, the John boat's motor dead and the map a sodden, meaningless relic in her lap. It had taken hours of silent, frantic polling through featureless channels to find a landmark she recognized, and by the time she stumbled back onto solid ground, the first hints of dawn were bleeding into the eastern sky. She felt hollowed out, scraped clean by fear and the swamp's oppressive silence. The curse had not driven her mad, but it had left its mark, a deep cellular weariness and a newfound healthy terror of the unknown. She drove for hours that day. The flat, straight ribbon of Highway 90, a welcome monotony after the twisting deceit of the marsh. She needed distance, the illusion of modernity, the simple, solid reality of asphalt under her tires. Night found her somewhere between Houma and Morgan City, the landscape a dark flatness punctuated by the occasional ghostly glow of a refinery in the distance. The road was nearly deserted, a tunnel of darkness carved by her headlights, the only company the thrum of the engine and the rhythmic click of the lane dividers. It was then that she saw her. A figure materialized at the edge of the cone of her headlights. A young woman standing impossibly still on the gravel shoulder, her arm held out in a silent, timeless plea for a ride. She wore a simple, light-colored dress that seemed too thin for the cool night air, her hair dark and hanging straight around her pale, expressionless face. There was an ethereal quality to her, a stillness that felt out of place on the lonely highway. A prickle of unease traced Alara's spine, but her folklorist's curiosity and a deeper, more compassionate impulse overrode her caution. She slowed and pulled over. The young woman moved with a strange, fluid grace, opening the passenger door and sliding into the seat without a word. She offered no greeting, no destination, simply stared straight ahead through the windshield into the endless night. The interior of the car grew noticeably colder, a damp chill that seemed to emanate from her silent form. Alara asked a few tentative questions: where she was headed, if she was okay, but received only silence in return. The girl's presence was a void, absorbing sound and warmth, her silence more unnerving than any conversation could have been. After 10 minutes of driving in this frigid, wordless companionship, Alara glanced to the passenger seat to try again. Her blood ran cold. The seat was empty. The young woman was simply gone. There had been no sound, no movement, no opening of the door. One moment she was there, a silent, cold statue. The next she had vanished into the night air as if she had never been there at all. A jolt of pure adrenaline seized Alara. She slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt on the deserted highway. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she frantically checked the empty seat, the floor, the locked door. There was nothing. No trace, no scent, not even a lingering chill. It was as if the cold had departed with her. Shaken to her core, she drove the rest of the way to her motel in a daze, the empty passenger seat feeling like an accusation. The next morning, the encounter felt like a fever dream, but the visceral memory of that sudden, impossible disappearance was too sharp to dismiss. Compelled by a need for proof, she visited the local parish library, its small microfilm archive a repository of the area's history. She wasn't sure what she was looking for until she found it. Buried in the classifieds of a newspaper from October 1962 was a brief, sorrowful article. A local girl, Marie Thibodeau, age 19, had vanished while walking home along Highway 90 after a disagreement with her beau. A massive search had turned up nothing. No clues, no body. She had simply ceased to exist. The article included a grainy yearbook photograph. Alara's breath caught in her throat. The face smiling shyly from the newsprint was unmistakable. It was the girl from the car, the silent, pale young woman with the dark hair and the light-colored dress. She had not been a hallucination or a trick of the light. She was a fragment of history, a moment of tragedy trapped in an endless loop on a lonely stretch of road, forever seeking a ride she would never complete to a home she would never reach. Alara sat back, the print blurring before her eyes. She had not just given a ghost a ride. She had borne witness to a decades-old heartbreak, another silent story the land refused to forget. Number 9. The Night Doctors of New Orleans. The phantom girl's silent departure from her car left a void that hummed with a different frequency of dread, one that pulled Alara back into the heart of New Orleans with a renewed and grim determination. The city's ornate ironwork and bubbling jazz now felt like a thin veneer over a substrata of older, darker histories. Her research led her down a particularly macabre alley of local lore, the whispered tales of the Night Doctors, a spectral echo of the city's grim past where medicine and morality had violently parted ways. In the 1800s, as medical schools flourished, the demand for fresh cadavers far outstripped the legal supply. This hunger gave birth to the resurrectionists, grave robbers who plundered cemeteries under cover of darkness, selling their ghastly wares to ambitious anatomists. But the stories she uncovered in the historical medical archives spoke of something even darker. Some whispers suggested that for a handful of particularly unscrupulous doctors, the line between exhuming the dead and creating new subjects had been treacherously blurred. The impoverished, the enslaved, those who would not be missed, they sometimes vanished from the shadowed streets of the French Quarter, only to end their days on a cold marble slab in a clandestine laboratory, their bodies serving as unwilling textbooks for surgical experimentation. Elara spent her days in the hushed, dusty reading rooms of the old medical library, her fingers tracing over chillingly clinical ledgers that listed payments for subjects with no names, only descriptions. The words were dry, academic, but they painted pictures of utter horror. As evening fell, she would walk the narrow, gas-lit streets of the quarter, trying to overlay the modern vibrancy with the grim reality of the past. The cheerful notes of a trumpet from a nearby bar seemed to warp, becoming the distant phantom echo of a bone saw. The laughter of tourists felt like a cruel joke over ground that had been dug up and violated. It was on the third night of her research that the feeling began, a persistent, prickling sensation at the nape of her neck, the unshakable certainty that her footsteps were not the only ones on the cobblestones. She would spin around, her heart in her throat, only to find the alley behind her empty, the shadows pooling innocently between the brightly painted shutters. Yet the feeling persisted, a cold pressure between her shoulder blades, a sense of being studied with a cold, clinical detachment. It was not the malevolent hunger of the lollery shadow, or the sorrowful weight of the weeping woman. This was the gaze of a collector, an assessor. She felt like a specimen being considered for a jar. Shaken, she hurried back to her guest house, taking a longer, brighter route, her keys clutched like a weapon in her fist. The feeling of being followed faded only when she was safely inside the courtyard gate. She took the stairs 2 at a time, craving the sanctuary of her room. But as she approached her door, her blood ran cold. There, placed squarely in the center of her welcome mat, was a single object. It was a surgical scalpel, but it was not modern. Its handle was aged ivory, yellowed and cracked with time, and it was fashioned into the shape of a serpent, its body coiled along the grip, its head forming the bolster. The blade, though spotted with age, was still wicked sharp. It lay there, gleaming dully in the low courtyard light, a thing of horrific beauty and terrifying intent. It was an antique, a relic from the very era she had been researching. This was no random prank or dropped item. It was a message, a calling card, a promise. The night doctors of history were gone, but their legacy, it seemed, was not confined to the pages of ledgers. Something had followed her home from the archives, and it had left its instrument on her doorstep, a silent, chilling warning that her curiosity had been noted and that she herself had now been catalogued. Number 10. The Haunting of Myrtles Plantation. The scalpel's serpentine handle felt like ice against Elara's palm, its presence on her doorstep a violation that resonated deeper than any spectral scream or phantom touch. It was a calculated, intelligent threat, a message from the past that knew her present. She needed to leave New Orleans, to escape the claustrophobic, watchful streets that now felt lined with unseen eyes and antique blades. Her research pointed her north, to St. Francisville and the legendary Myrtles Plantation, a place reputed to be one of America's most haunted homes. It promised a different kind of story, one of tragic error rather than calculated evil, and she clung to that distinction like a lifeline. The drive was a blur of Spanish moss and fading afternoon light. The plantation emerged from the lush greenery like a waking dream, a pristine example of antebellum grandeur with its sweeping white columns, wide verandas, and intricate ironwork. It was breathtakingly beautiful, a postcard image of southern elegance, but as Elara stepped from her car, the same familiar dread she had come to know so well settled over her like a shroud. The beauty felt fragile, a glamour laid over a deep and festering wound. She was shown to her room, the Judge Woodruff room, by a soft-spoken staff member whose smile didn't quite reach her eyes. The room was opulent, dominated by a massive four-poster bed and an ornately carved armoire, but the air was heavy and still, thick with the scent of old wood and dried roses. A large antique mirror hung opposite the bed, its silvered glass seeming to hold the room in a dim, watchful grasp. That evening she joined a small ghost tour on the main veranda. The guide, a woman with a melodious voice and a practiced somberness, began the plantation's most famous tale, the legend of Chloe. She was an enslaved woman, owned by Judge Clark Woodruff, the story went, who had been caught eavesdropping on the family. As punishment, one of her ears was brutally severed. Desperate to regain favor, Chloe had baked a cake laced with oleander from the garden, intending to make the family mildly ill so she could nurse them back to health and prove her worth. But the poison was too strong. She succeeded only in killing the judge's wife and two of his young daughters. In a fit of rage and terror, the other enslaved people hanged Chloe from a tree on the property and threw her body into the Mississippi. Her spirit, the guide concluded with a theatrical flourish, was said to remain, a restless presence often seen as a woman in a green turban, hiding her mutilated ear, forever seeking forgiveness she would never receive. The story was a tragedy of horrific miscalculation and brutal consequence, and it hung in the humid night air. Back in her room, Alara tried to shake off the tale's grim weight. She unpacked her camera, its solid modern presence a comfort. She took a few test shots of the room's details, the carving on the bedpost, the pattern of the wallpaper, anything to anchor herself in the present. As she reviewed the images on the digital screen, a wave of fatigue washed over her, sudden and overwhelming. She hadn't realized how exhausted she was. Rubbing her eyes, she absently pushed up the sleeve of her shirt to massage her forearm, and a jolt of shock went through her. There, on the pale skin of her inner arm, just below the elbow, was a bruise. It was small, no larger than a silver dollar, and a peculiar mottled purple-blue, but it was its shape that made her breath catch. It was not a random blotch. It was unmistakably the shape of a small, delicate handprint, as if a child with a strong, cold grip had seized her arm. The fingers were clearly defined, the impression perfect. She stared at it, her mind racing. She had not bumped into anything. She had felt no impact. The skin was not tender to the touch. It was simply there, a silent, inexplicable brand. Her hands trembling, she raised her camera. The flash was a stark white explosion in the dim room. On the screen, the image was chillingly clear. The bruise stood out in lurid detail against her skin, the shape of the small hand undeniable. It was proof, not of a ghost seen or a sound heard, but of a touch, a physical interaction from the unseen world. The legend of Chloe was no longer just a story told on a veranda. The poisoned children had reached out from beyond the veil, and in the silence of the judge's room they had left their mark upon her. The phantom handprint on her arm was a cold anchor in the real world, a tactile proof of the intangible that left Alara's mind reeling. She spent the remainder of the night in a state of heightened alert, every creak of the old house a potential footstep, every shift of shadow in the corner a possible movement. Sleep was impossible. She sat rigid in a velvet-upholstered chair, her gaze fixed on the ornate mirror across the room, its surface a dark liquid pool reflecting the dim glow of the single lamp she kept burning. The image of the small bruised handprint seemed burned onto her retina, a mark of contact that felt less like a greeting and more like a claim. As the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the heavy drapes, a profound exhaustion finally overrode her fear. Her eyelids grew heavy, her head nodding forward despite her best efforts. The lamp's glow seemed to soften and stretch, the room tilting into a hazy pre-dream state. It was in this vulnerable, half-aware moment that a primal instinct screamed at her to look up. Her eyes snapped open, focusing automatically on the mirror. For a heartbeat, she saw only her own reflection, pale, wide-eyed and utterly alone in the opulent room. Then, movement. In the silvered glass, just over her own shoulder, A figure solidified from the gloom behind her chair. It was the form of a young girl, her features blurred and indistinct, her dress a faded shade of white. One small pale hand was raised, not in a wave, but held aloft, its fingers curled slightly, as if caught in the moment just after releasing its grip. A bolt of pure, undiluted terror, colder than the Lalaurie shadow and sharper than the antique scalpel, lanced through Alara. This was no peripheral glimpse or trick of the light. It was a full, detailed apparition in the one place that offered no possibility of error, the reflective truth of the mirror. Her own eyes in the glass were wide with horror, locked onto the spectral child standing silently behind her empty chair. Her body moved before her mind could process the command. A strangled cry tore from her throat as she launched herself from the chair, spinning around to confront the space behind her. The movement was too frantic, too violent. The chair legs screeched against the wooden floor, but there was nothing there. The space behind the chair was empty, the air still and cold. She whirled back to the mirror, her heart hammering against her ribs like a frantic drum. Her own terrified reflection stared back, alone once more. The girl was gone. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound. It was the silence of a truth too awful to bear. The plantation's beauty was a lie, its elegant rooms nothing more than gilded cages for sorrows that would not rest. She could not stay here. She would not spend another moment in this room where the dead could touch her, could watch her from the glass. Her flight was not a decision but a reflex. She grabbed her bag, not bothering to pack, her belongings scattered across the bed and floor. She fumbled with the door latch, her hands shaking so violently she could barely turn the knob. She fled down the grand staircase, past the portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to track her panic, and out into the weak morning light. The manicured grounds, once beautiful, now felt like a gilded trap. She did not look back at the columned facade. She threw herself into her car, the engine roaring to life, and sped down the long oak-lined drive without a single glance in the rearview mirror. The Myrtles Plantation shrank behind her, but the image in the mirror, the pale, blurred face of the girl over her shoulder, was burned into her mind forever. She vowed with a certainty that shook her to her core that she would never return, that some doors once opened could never be closed, and some reflections held truths too terrible to ever face again. Number 11. The Cajun Feu Follet. The flat, straight road away from the Myrtles Plantation offered no solace, only the monotonous hum of tires on asphalt and the ghost of a child's handprint still faintly visible on her arm. The elegant terror of the haunted house had been replaced by a raw, nervous energy that demanded wilderness, a vastness where ghosts felt less personal, more elemental. Her path led her deep into the heart of the Atchafalaya Basin, the largest river swamp in North America, a place where water and land were locked in an ancient, tangled embrace. Here the legends were not of tortured souls in mansions, but of elusive, deceptive lights that danced with malicious intent, the Cajun Feu Follet. She arrived at a remote fishing camp as the sun began to bleed into the western horizon, setting the still waters of the bayou on fire with oranges and purples. The air was a thick broth of humidity and the rich decaying scent of cypress and swamp bloom. The camp consisted of a few weathered shacks on stilts and a single rickety dock that extended into the tea-colored water. The man who rented her a small pirogue and a powerful flashlight had the sun-leathered skin and cautious eyes of someone who respected the swamp's many moods. When she mentioned her interest in the will-o'-the-wisps, the marshlights, his expression grew grim. He warned her in a low, serious tone that the old stories were to be heeded. The Feu Follet were not natural gas, he insisted, but something far more cunning. They were the lost souls of sinners, or the playful, cruel tricks of a swamp spirit, luring the unwary off the safe channels and into the trackless, sucking mire. They promised treasure, safe passage, or the way home, but they delivered only despair and a cold, muddy death. His final piece of advice was simple and dire. You see a light that don't belong, you turn your boat around and you row the other way. Don't you follow it, it ain't for you. As full darkness fell, the swamp transformed. The vibrant greens and golds of day were swallowed by a profound blackness, a void so complete it felt solid. The chorus of frogs and insects was a deafening wall of sound. Elara pushed her pirogue away from the dock, the beam of her flashlight a frail, trembling spear cutting through the oppressive dark. She told herself she was only observing, that she would heed the warning. She was a researcher, not a fool. For an hour she drifted, recording the sounds, noting the eerie beauty of the cypress knees revealed in her light, like a congregation of silent, twisted figures. Then she saw it, a soft bluish glow, bobbing gently about 50 yards away, deep within a narrow, choked-off slough she knew was not on any safe channel. It pulsed with a gentle, hypnotic rhythm, utterly different from the harsh beam of her own light. It was beautiful, alluring. The warnings echoed in her mind, but they were distant, muffled by a sudden, intense curiosity. It moved, drifting slowly deeper into the slough. Without conscious thought, she turned the pirogue and followed. The light led her on a twisting, treacherous path. She had to duck under low-hanging branches thick with moss, and her pole frequently sank into deep, soft mud. The sounds of the main bayou faded behind her, replaced by a closer, more intimate silence broken only by the drip of water from her pole and the soft, inviting pulse of the light ahead. It always stayed just out of reach, a tantalizing promise in the darkness. She lost all sense of time and direction, her world reduced to the circle of her flashlight and the mesmerizing blue glow. Dawn found her not on the water, but on a small, unstable hummock of solid ground, her pirogue lodged in the mud several feet away. She was soaked to the skin, caked in muck, and shivering with a deep, bone-weary cold. The beautiful blue light had vanished with the first hint of gray in the sky, abandoning her completely. The feu follet had gotten what it wanted. She was utterly lost, surrounded by a labyrinth of identical moss-draped trees and stagnant water. Exhaustion and a crushing sense of folly washed over her. She had been so arrogant, so sure her intellect could override the oldest of warnings. It was the distant, blessed sound of an outboard motor that finally signaled her rescue. A search party of local fishermen, alerted by the camp owner when she hadn't returned, found her just as the sun fully cleared the cypress canopy. They hauled her, trembling and disoriented, into their boat, their faces a mixture of relief and grim understanding. They asked no questions. They had seen this before. The swamp had whispered its deceptive lullaby, and she, like so many before her, had foolishly chosen to listen. As their boat carried her back toward the world of solid ground and reason, she looked back at the vast green darkness. The feu follet had shown her its face, not one of horror, but of serene, indifferent betrayal. It was a lesson written in mud and exhaustion. Some lights in the darkness are not guides, but predators. Number 12. The Legend of Grunch Road. The memory of the feu follet's cold, indifferent betrayal was a fresh brand on Elara's spirit, a lesson in the swamp's particular brand of cruelty. It was a deception of the wild, a lure into the mire, but her research now pulled her toward a legend born of a different kind of darkness, one not of nature's trickery, but of human transgression and its monstrous aftermath. She drove east of New Orleans, toward the isolated, forgotten stretches of land that bordered the wild cypress swamps, where the asphalt was cracked and the Spanish moss hung like tattered funeral shrouds. This was the domain of the Grunch. The stories were fragmented, whispered in backroad bars, and dismissed by city officials as the ravings of swamp folk and drunkards. They spoke of a secluded, defunct road, once intended for a development that never was, now reclaimed by the wilderness, and they spoke of what lived there. The Grunch was not a ghost or a spirit, but a thing of flesh and blood or something approximating it. Descriptions varied from teller to teller, a pack of feral, mutated creatures with glowing eyes and twisted limbs, the result of some long-ago chemical spill or a cursed family's inbred lineage. They were said to be unnaturally strong, vicious, and possessed of a guttural, inhuman intelligence. They were the boogeymen of the bayou, the reason parents told their children not to wander, the reason hunters avoided that particular stretch of road after dark. Elara's curiosity, now tempered by a hard-won caution, compelled her to see the place for herself. As dusk began to bleed the color from the sky, she turned off the main highway onto a narrow, potholed lane that could barely be called a road. Ancient gnarled oaks formed a tunnel overhead, their branches weaving together to block out the fading light. Kudzu swallowed abandoned cars and fence posts alike, giving the landscape a soft, green, decomposing feel. The air grew thick and still, the sounds of civilization fading into a profound silence broken only by the crunch of her tires on gravel and the occasional cry of a night bird. She had driven perhaps a mile down this forsaken track when her headlights flickered once, twice, and then died completely. The engine gave a final, pathetic shudder and fell silent. The sudden quiet was absolute, a physical weight pressing in on the car. Darkness, deeper and more complete than any she had experienced, enveloped her. She was utterly alone, stranded on a road that officially didn't exist, in the heart of the Grunch's purported territory. Her heart began to hammer, a frantic drum against her ribs. She fumbled for her flashlight, its beam a weak, pathetic sword in the overwhelming blackness. She popped the hood, though she knew nothing about engines, the metal creaking loudly in the silence. The underside was a confusing tangle of wires and metal, offering no answers. As she stood there, the beam of her light shaking, the first sound reached her. It was a low, wet, guttural sound, like rocks grinding together in a throat not meant for speech. It came from the impenetrable wall of vegetation to her right, close enough to make the fine hairs on her arms stand up. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound came again, closer this time, and was answered by another from the opposite side of the road. Something was moving in the undergrowth, something heavy and deliberate. She scrambled back into the driver's seat, locking the doors with trembling hands, her flashlight beam darting wildly across the windows, revealing nothing but the solid blackness of the swamp. Then it started. A slow, deliberate scraping sound along the roof of the car. It was a dry, rasping drag like something hard and rough being drawn over the metal. It started at the rear and moved with agonizing slowness toward the front. Alara stared up at the roof liner, her blood turning to ice. The scraping paused directly above her head. In the terrible silence that followed, she heard it, a low, rhythmic sniffing, as if something were scenting the air, trying to catch her smell through the steel and glass. The guttural sounds from the woods began again, a conversation of clicks and grunts that circled the vehicle. The scraping on the roof resumed, this time with more pressure, accompanied by a low, vibrating growl that she could feel through the car's frame. They were testing it, testing her cage. Her flashlight beam, jerking uncontrollably, caught a glimpse of something at the edge of the tree line, a pair of eyes reflecting the light, not with the familiar green shine of an animal, but with a dull reddish luminescence. They were set too far apart, and they blinked slowly, with a terrible patient intelligence. She was trapped, a specimen in a glass jar, surrounded by things that knew she was there, things that were curious, and things that were hungry. The legend of Grunch Road was no longer a story. It was the guttural sound outside her window, the scraping on her roof, and the patient, glowing eyes watching her from the unforgiving dark. The final revelation. The memory of the Grunch's guttural threats and the patient, glowing eyes outside her car window was a fresh scar on Ilara's psyche, a final brutal confirmation that the world was far stranger and more dangerous than she had ever dared to imagine. Her escape from that forsaken road had been a blur of frantic prayer and a miraculous, inexplicable restart of her engine, as if the things in the dark had grown bored of their trapped prey and simply allowed her to flee. She drove through the remainder of the night and the next day in a numb, silent daze, not stopping until she found herself on a secluded stretch of shoreline along Lake Pontchartrain, far from any road, any legend, any human eye. The sun was setting, casting a path of fiery gold across the still, dark water. She sat on the coarse sand, her knees drawn to her chest, and for the first time since her arrival in Louisiana, she allowed the full weight of her experiences to crash over her. They were no longer isolated incidents, fascinating data points in a research paper. They were a chorus, a converging storm of narratives that she had been blindly walking through. The Lougarou mansion's calculated cruelty, the Rougarou's primal curse, the crying woman's boundless grief, the voodoo queen's potent legacy, the ghost ship's endless vigil, the melonhead's feral survival, Lafitte's greedy madness, the hitchhiker's silent tragedy, the night doctor's clinical horror, Myrtles Plantation's poisoned sorrow, the Feu Follet's deceptive lure, the Grunch's monstrous mutation. Piece by agonizing piece, they locked together in her mind, not as separate tales but as facets of a single terrible truth. These were not merely ghost stories, they were warnings, eternal, repeating echoes of the deepest human failings, trauma, greed, injustice, and prejudice that had been so violently imprinted upon this land that the very soil, the water, the air itself remembered. Louisiana was not just haunted, it was a living archive of pain, and the spirits were its curators, its eternal witnesses. They were the land's memory, and they refused to be forgotten. A profound and terrifying understanding settled over her, as cold and certain as the touch of the Myrtles child. She had not been randomly collecting these stories. She had been following a trail of breadcrumbs laid out for her, each encounter a lesson, a piece of a larger puzzle she was meant to solve. The innkeeper's knowing gaze, the practitioner's grave warning, the scalpel on her doorstep, they were all signposts on this path. The stories were converging on her, their weight and their meaning settling onto her shoulders alone. She was the focal point, the silent recipient of a truth too vast and too awful for any one person to hold. The ghosts of Louisiana had not been showing off, they had been testifying, and she, Alara, was their chosen scribe. The final revelation was not about them, it was about her role in their endless sorrowful story. The air around her grew heavy, charged with the presence of countless watching eyes, all waiting for her to finally understand the burden she had been given. The weight of the revelation did not crush her, it forged her. Sitting on the lonely shore of Lake Pontchartrain, with the last light of day bleeding into the water, Alara felt the final piece of the terrible, beautiful puzzle lock into place. The whispers of the innkeeper, the cold spots in the mansion, the howl in the bayou, the sobs across the water, the symbols in the dust, the silent hitchhiker, the scalpel on the step, the handprint on her arm, the eyes in the dark. They were not random hauntings. They were a summons, a relentless guided curriculum in the language of loss. She had believed herself a researcher, an observer, a collector of stories, but she had been a student all along, and the spirits themselves had been her instructors. They had chosen her for her seeking heart, her empathy, her willingness to look into the abyss without immediately turning away. They had tested her courage with shadows and mutilated pirates, her compassion with weeping mothers and poisoned children, her resolve with deceptive lights and feral things in the night. Each encounter had been a lesson, a chapter in a grim textbook written in cold and sorrow, preparing her for this moment of ultimate understanding. She was not just studying legends, she had been anointed to bear witness. As this truth settled into her soul, a profound change swept through the air around her. The oppressive weight of being watched, the constant chilling pressure that had dogged her steps since her first day, began to lift. It did not vanish, but it receded, pulling back like a tide from the shore. The countless presences that had crowded the periphery of her vision, the whispers that had threaded through her dreams, the cold touches and unnerving signs, they withdrew. It was not an abandonment, but a release, a silent collective exhale from the unseen world. The testimony was complete. The verdict had been delivered to the one appointed to carry it. She was alone on the beach, but for the first time, the solitude did not feel like isolation. It felt like a sacred space. The mandate given to her was not written on parchment or whispered on the wind. It was branded on her soul. The truths she had uncovered were not hers to keep. They were a trust, a sacred charge. She was to be their voice. She was to take the echoes of trauma, greed, and injustice that the land itself remembered and share them with a world that had too often chosen to forget. She was to make the silent, Seen, rising from the sand, Alara knew she would never be the same. The woman who had arrived in New Orleans, filled with academic curiosity and a touch of skepticism, was gone. In her place stood a chronicler of the unseen, a bridge between the world of the living and the world of memory. The ghosts of Louisiana had receded, their work done, but they had left her forever changed, imbued with a purpose that eclipsed fear. She turned her back on the darkening lake, her path forward now illuminated not by a flashlight, but by the cold, sure light of 1,000 sorrows, and a mandate to ensure they would never, ever be forgotten.